The morning Pauline Dawson walked into the town of Redrock Crossing with nothing but a threadbare carpetbag, a 6-year-old daughter clutching her hand, and a single gold coin pressed so hard into her palm that it left a circle of white flesh. She was not looking for salvation. She was looking for a way to survive until nightfall. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was not a place that forgave weakness. The summer heat rose off the red dirt roads in visible waves, bending the air into something that looked almost liquid, and the sky above was the kind of blue that should have been beautiful, but instead felt merciless, like a lid pressed down over everything that lived and struggled beneath it. Redrock Crossing was a proper town by frontier standards, a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other, a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Copper Crown, a small church at the north end, and a sheriff's office whose windows were never quite clean enough to see through from the outside. There was a hotel too, the Redrock Arms, which offered rooms at 50 cents a night, a price that Pauline had already calculated 3 times in her head against the worth of the single coin she carried. She had been walking for 2 days. Her husband, Robert Dawson, had died 6 weeks prior in the town of Mesa Flat, 40 miles east, from a fever that took him in 4 days and left Pauline with a 6-year-old named Clara, a rented room they could no longer afford, a horse that had already been sold to cover the funeral, and the gold coin that Robert had pressed into her hand the night before the fever pulled him under for good. He had told her with the last strength he had in his fingers to use it only when there was no other choice. She had honored that request for 6 weeks, selling her good dress, her spare pair of boots, and 2 silver hairpins that had belonged to her mother. She had taken in mending, washed other people's clothes, swept the boarding house floors in exchange for an extra week of lodging. But Mesa Flat had nothing more to offer a widow without land, without family, and without the kind of name that made other people inclined to extend credit. Someone in Mesa Flat had told her that Redrock Crossing had a new doctor and a growing population, that there was work for a woman willing to cook or clean or sew, that it was the kind of town that was still deciding what it wanted to become, and therefore still open to people arriving with almost nothing. She had put Clara on her back for the last 6 miles when the child's feet gave out, and she had walked through the gate of Redrock Crossing with her jaw set and her eyes dry, because she had already used up every tear she had to spare somewhere on the road between then and now. The first thing she did was stop at the well in the center of town and give Clara water from the public ladle. The second thing she did was look around with the particular careful attention of a woman who is assessing danger and opportunity at the same time. The third thing she did was notice the man sitting on the porch of the general store across the street. He was not doing anything remarkable. He was simply sitting, leaning back in a wooden chair with one boot resting on the porch rail, reading what appeared to be a newspaper with the particular focused expression of someone who actually intends to finish the article. He wore a plain blue chambray shirt and dark trousers, brown leather boots that had seen considerable use, and a hat that had once been black but had been weathered by sun and dust to the color of old charcoal. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ears and a jaw that needed shaving. He looked solid in the way that men who do actual physical work tend to look solid, not theatrical about it, just genuinely built from use. What Pauline noticed most was that he was the only person on the main street who had not already looked at her with either suspicion or pity. He had not looked at her at all, which felt in that moment like a strange form of courtesy. She did not speak to him then. She walked to the general store, which was where she intended to ask after work, and she stepped up onto the porch and pushed through the door and was immediately hit with the smell of dried goods and leather and the faint sweetness of cured tobacco. A stout woman with gray-streaked hair and shrewd brown eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Help you?" the woman said. "I am hoping so," Pauline said, and she meant it with every bone in her tired body. "My name is Pauline Dawson. I arrived today from Mesa Flat. I am a widow with a daughter and I am looking for work. I cook well, I sew well, I can keep accounts if the numbers are straightforward, and I am not afraid of hard work. I would be grateful to know if there is anything available in town." The woman behind the counter studied her with the unsentimental efficiency of someone who had made many quick assessments of strangers and been right more often than not. She looked at Pauline's worn dress, at the tidy way she held herself despite the road dust, at Clara standing quietly at her mother's side with wide gray eyes and a composure that suggested the child had learned early to be still and undemanding. "I am Ruth Farley," the woman said. "My husband and I run this store. We have no open positions ourselves just now, but I know who might." She paused. "The hotel needs a breakfast cook. Mrs. Aldrich let her last girl go 3 weeks back for stealing from the pantry. You would want to speak to Alina Aldrich directly. Hotel is at the south end of the main street. You cannot miss the sign." "Thank you," Pauline said, and she meant that too. She was almost to the door when Ruth Farley spoke again, her voice quieter now. "Mrs. Dawson, be careful who you speak to about your circumstances before you have a position settled. There are men in this town who see a widow without means as an opportunity of a particular kind. Keep your cards close until you know the lay of the land." Pauline turned back and looked at her steadily. "I have been keeping my cards close for 6 weeks," she said. "I am accustomed to it." Ruth Farley gave a small nod that contained within it something that was almost respect. Outside on the porch, the man with the charcoal-colored hat had folded his newspaper and was now standing, tucking it under his arm with the unhurried ease of someone who exists comfortably in his own body. Up close he was taller than he had appeared from across the street, and his eyes, when they landed briefly on Pauline as she stepped out of the store, were a warm, steady brown. He touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said simply, and moved past her into the store. It was a nothing exchange. Pauline filed it away and walked south toward the hotel. The position at the hotel materialized, as things sometimes do when a person arrives at exactly the right moment and presents themselves with enough quiet competence to put someone else's anxiety to rest. Alina Aldrich was a narrow, brisk woman in her late 50s, who had been running the Redrock Arms for 11 years without a husband, and who therefore had no patience for drama or incompetence, but a great deal of respect for self-sufficiency. She hired Pauline within 15 minutes of meeting her, offered her a small room off the kitchen for herself and Clara, in addition to a wage of $3 a week, and told her to begin the following morning at 5 o'clock. The room was barely larger than a generous closet, with a narrow bed that Pauline and Clara would have to share, and a single window that looked out at the alley behind the hotel, but it had a door that locked and a roof that did not leak. And after 6 weeks of uncertainty, those two things felt like extraordinary luxury. That first night, with Clara asleep curled against her side, Pauline held the gold coin in the dark and thought about Robert. She did not cry. She was past crying, or at least past crying for herself. She thought about him with the complicated grief of a woman who had loved a man genuinely, but who also knew, with clear eyes, that he had not been particularly good at the practical business of keeping a family safe. He had been kind and funny and warm, and he had believed in the next good thing the way some men believe in God, with an absolute faith that was not diminished by repeated evidence to the contrary. He had come west because someone told him there was land to be had, and there had been, briefly, a small homestead claim east of Mesa Flat that had not survived a second dry summer. He had loved Pauline and Clara with everything he had. He had simply not had quite enough of the other things a family needed, and now he was gone, and Pauline was in a small room in a town she did not know, holding a coin she had not yet needed to spend, and the task before her was to build something solid enough that Clara would not have to carry the weight of this particular kind of uncertainty when she grew up. She closed her fingers around the coin and held it like a compass, and then she put it in the small cloth pouch she wore against her skin beneath her dress, and she slept. The work at the hotel was demanding and familiar. Pauline was up before the sun every morning, laying fires and heating water and beginning the long process of producing a breakfast that would satisfy the rotating cast of travelers, miners, land agents, and ranchers who passed through the Redrock Arms. She was good at it. She had been cooking for other people since she was 12 years old, first in her mother's house in Missouri, where they took in boarders, then in her married home, and she understood the particular alchemy of making simple ingredients stretch into something that felt abundant. Eleanor Aldrich, who was not free with praise, told her after the third morning that she was the best breakfast cook the hotel had employed, and that she hoped she intended to stay. Clara spent the mornings helping in small ways, setting out the salt and pepper, carrying folded napkins to the tables, sweeping the kitchen steps, and the afternoons in the company of Ruth Farley's youngest daughter, a girl of 8 named Bess, who had taken an immediate and determined interest in Clara with the particular intensity that only lonely 8-year-olds possess. This arrangement suited everyone. Ruth Farley liked having her daughter occupied. Clara had a friend for the first time in months, and Pauline could work without constant worry about where her daughter was. She had been in Redrock Crossing for 10 days when she encountered Martin Boone properly. He came in for breakfast on a Thursday morning, which was unusual because the hotel's breakfast service was primarily for guests, and Pauline had not seen him among the rooms. He sat at the end of the long table near the window and accepted coffee from the young man who helped with service, and when Pauline came out of the kitchen to deliver a plate of eggs and cornbread to the table, she recognized him immediately, the weathered hat now on the hook by the door, the same steady brown eyes, the same quality of being entirely at ease in whatever space he occupied. "You are not a hotel guest," she said, which was not quite a question. He looked up at her with a slight, surprised smile. "No, ma'am. Eleanor Aldrich lets me eat here when I need to. She owes me a debt from 2 winters back when I fixed her roof in the middle of a snowstorm." He tilted his head slightly. "You are the new cook." "I am," Pauline said. "Pauline Dawson." "Martin Boone," he said, and held out his hand the way a person does when they have been raised to treat everyone as worthy of the same courtesy. She shook it briefly and went back to the kitchen because she had 4 more plates to send out and a second pot of coffee to watch. But she was aware, in the way that a person becomes aware of a new piece of furniture in a familiar room, that he was there, and that he ate quietly and read his newspaper, and that he left a small coin beside his empty plate, even though the meal was covered by Eleanor's debt, which she only learned afterward from Eleanor herself. "That is Martin Boone," Eleanor told her when she asked. "He ranches a small spread about 4 miles west of town. Been here 6 years. Came out from Tennessee, I believe, or somewhere close to it. Good man, keeps to himself mostly. Helps people when they need it and does not make a show of it. Was married once, his wife died in childbirth 3 years back, the baby too. Has not been with anyone since, as far as anyone can tell, though it is not from lack of interest on the part of several women in this town." Pauline absorbed this information and said nothing, and Eleanor looked at her with the same kind of quick, shrewd assessment that Ruth Farley had used on their first meeting, and then said, "He comes in for breakfast most Thursdays when he is in town for supplies." Pauline returned to scrubbing the breakfast dishes and thought about a man who fixed roofs in snowstorms and left coins he did not owe, and she did not allow herself to think about it beyond that because she had enough to think about already. Redrock Crossing in the late summer of 1878 was a town that was growing faster than its structures could properly contain, and with that growth came a certain amount of friction. There were 3 saloons by August, and the miners who came down from the hills on weekends had a tendency to resolve their disagreements in ways that occasionally spilled out of the saloons and into the main street. There was a sheriff named Carl Hatcher, who was competent enough at keeping the peace between parties who had an interest in staying peaceful, but who had a blind spot for a man named Denton Creel. Denton Creel was not technically an outlaw. He owned a share in one of the local mines and had a legitimate claim to respectability that he maintained with just enough surface polish to keep Sheriff Hatcher from looking too closely at his other activities, which included a series of small, difficult-to-prove schemes that extracted money from people who could not easily afford to lose it. He lent money at rates that most people understood to be predatory only after they had already accepted the terms. He had an arrangement with the man who ran the land claims office that involved certain paperwork being lost or delayed in ways that benefited Creel's mining interests. He was the kind of man who understood power the way a water finds a path downhill, not through force exactly, but through the patient identification of low points. He noticed Pauline Dawson approximately 2 weeks after she arrived in Redrock Crossing, which was about the same time most men in town did, because she was a young woman 28 years old, dark-haired and gray-eyed and handsome in a way that had nothing theatrical about it, who was clearly alone, and clearly without the kind of male connection that a frontier town understood as protection. He began appearing at the hotel for breakfast with a regularity that had not characterized his habits before, and he was always civil and always complimentary in a way that never quite crossed the line into something Pauline could directly object to. And she recognized the type immediately, because she had encountered versions of him in Mesa Flat and in the town before that, and she understood that what he was doing was establishing his presence in her vicinity until she became accustomed to it, which was the first step in a longer process. She was polite and distant and let nothing show on her face, which she was good at, and she made sure that she was never alone in a room with him, which was easy enough in the hotel's public spaces. But she was aware of him the way a person is aware of weather coming in from the west, and she noted that his attentions, though never overtly threatening, had a quality of patience about them that she did not trust. It was Ruth Farley who told her the specifics. Clara had been spending her afternoons at the Farley store with Bess, and Pauline stopped in one Friday afternoon to collect her daughter and found Ruth watching the main street with a particular expression. "Denton Creel has been asking about you," Ruth said without preamble. Pauline set down the cloth she had been folding. "Asking what exactly? Whether you have family, whether you own any land, whether the hotel position is your only income." Ruth paused. "He has been known to purchase the debts of widows in this territory. He finds women who have fallen into arrears somewhere, alone, a land claim fee they cannot pay, and he buys the debt from whoever holds it and uses the leverage to propose an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Ruth looked at her directly. "Marriage, in the technical sense, which in practice means having a woman attached to his household and his interests without the expense of actual courtship." Pauline was quiet for a moment. "I have no debts," she said. "I know," Ruth said, "but a woman in your position alone, without a man's name on her land or her lodgings, there are ways that situation can be made precarious by a man who has the patience and the connections to manufacture a precarity where none exists. I am not saying he will. I am saying I have seen it before, and I thought you should know who you are dealing with." That night Pauline sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at Clara asleep beside her and took out the gold coin and held it in both hands. It was a $20 gold piece, which was more money than it sounded like and less money than she needed it to be. She thought about what Ruth had told her, and she thought about the particular vulnerability of her position. A woman with no name in this territory that commanded any weight, no land, no male relative who could stand beside her in any legal or social sense, nothing except her own competence and the fragile shelter of Eleanor Aldrich's employment. She pressed her thumb against the face of the coin until it was warm from her skin. She thought about Martin Boone fixing a widow's roof in a snowstorm. She thought about the coin he had left beside a plate for a meal he did not owe. She thought about how she had not allowed herself to think about any of this for longer than she should have. The following Thursday she was extra careful with the eggs. He noticed. Of course, he noticed men who pay attention to things tend to notice when something is different. And Martin Boone had the particular quality of observation that comes from years of working alone on land, where small details are the difference between a good season and a bad one. "These are better than last week," he said, which was not a compliment most people would have thought to offer, because most people did not remember the precise quality of what they had eaten the previous Thursday well enough to make the comparison. "I found where a leaner keeps the good salt," Pauline said from the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. He looked up at her. "Is that the secret?" "That and patience," she said. "Most people rush eggs." He considered this seriously. The way she was coming to understand he considered most things. "I believe that," he said. She went back into the kitchen and did not allow herself to smile until she was certain her back was fully turned. Over the next 3 weeks, a routine established itself that neither of them explicitly designed, but that both of them, she believed, quietly tended. He came in on Thursdays, sometimes Tuesdays as well when his supply runs required it. He ate at the end of the table by the window. If Pauline came out of the kitchen to check on service, which she did more often than strict professional necessity required, they exchanged a few words. About the food, about the weather, about something he had read in the newspaper that was occasionally interesting and occasionally ridiculous, about a problem Clara had solved with surprising creativity, about the quality of the current summer heat versus the heat of previous summers, as a matter of general philosophical inquiry. It was nothing, and it was not nothing. It was conversation of the kind that builds a picture of a person, slowly, one small piece at a time. And Pauline was building a picture of Martin Boone the way she had built many things in her life, with care and without rushing. He was a man who had come west not from the romance of it, she learned, but from the specific practical reality that land in Tennessee was not available to him in the amounts he needed to build a life the way he wanted to build one. He had saved money for 3 years before making the journey, had researched the territory carefully, had arrived in Arizona in 1872 with enough capital to purchase his small ranch outright rather than homesteading it, which meant he owned it clean and owed no one anything for it. The ranch ran a modest herd of cattle with the help of 2 hands brothers named Pio and Santos Reyes, who were Mexican-American men from Tucson and who, Martin mentioned once with a particular quietness in his voice, were the best ranch hands in the territory and were paid accordingly, which was not the universal practice among ranchers in that part of Arizona, and which said something about the kind of man Martin Boone was that Pauline took careful note of. He read constantly. He played chess against himself on the evenings he stayed at the hotel, using a small portable set that he carried in his coat pocket. He had a younger brother back east who wrote him letters every few months, and he wrote back diligently. He made no show of any of it. Pauline, in the careful way she had of assembling what she knew about a person before she decided what to do with that knowledge, thought about all of this. She thought about the fact that she was attracted to him, not in the breathless, anxious way she had been attracted to Robert in their early days, which she now understood had been partly the attraction of inexperience, of choosing the first person who offered warmth because warmth was what she had needed most, but in a steadier, more considered way, the way a person recognizes something true when they have learned enough to know the difference between truth and its resemblance. She was also aware that she could not afford to let attraction lead her anywhere without first attending to the more pressing practical matter of Denton Creel. He had made his move on a Saturday in late September, and it was more direct than Pauline had anticipated. She was locking the back door of the hotel kitchen after the afternoon cleaning when he appeared in the alley, not lurking, not threatening in any obvious physical way, but present in a manner that blocked casual exit and that he would have described, if asked, as a chance encounter. He was a man of perhaps 45, with the particular sleekness of someone who had always eaten well and who wore his prosperity in the way he held his body, as if the world were arranged primarily for his comfort. He had light eyes and a wide, easy smile that did not reach those eyes. "Mrs. Son," he said, "I have been hoping for a moment to speak with you privately." "I have a great deal to do before supper," Pauline said pleasantly, because pleasantness cost nothing and revealed nothing. "This will not take long." He stepped slightly closer, not close enough to be threatening, close enough. "I wanted to make you aware of an opportunity I think would benefit you considerably. I have a large house on the east end of town, perhaps you have seen it. I am in need of someone to manage the household. Cooking, accounts, organization. It is demanding work, but the position comes with significant advantages: a comfortable room, proper wages, and the security that a woman in your situation might find very appealing." "I have a position," Pauline said. "At the hotel." "Eleanor Aldrich's hotel," he said, with the faint, careful emphasis of a man reminding you that the ground beneath your feet belongs to someone else, which she could decide at any time. She no longer requires your services. The threat in it was perfectly placed, not stated, not provable, just present. "If that should happen, I will find another position," Pauline said, with exactly the same pleasant tone she had used for everything else. He studied her for a moment. "You have a daughter," he said. "A child in this territory without proper support is vulnerable. I would hate to see either of you come to difficulty that could easily be prevented." Pauline looked at him for a long, steady moment. "Good afternoon, Mr. Creel," she said, and walked past him with her chin level and her hands perfectly still at her sides. She was not frightened, or rather, she was frightened in the specific, productive way that translates itself into action rather than paralysis, which was the only kind of frightened she had allowed herself to be for a long time. But that night, after Clara was asleep, she lay awake and turned over her options the way a person turns over cards on a table, looking for a hand that can actually be played. The gold coin was in her pouch against her skin. She thought, "I have been saving this for Clara. I have been saving it for the last possible thing. But if Denton Creel has the patience and the connections that Ruth described, then the last possible thing may arrive sooner than I am prepared for it." She thought, what does a gold coin buy in Redrock Crossing in September of 1878? She thought, a lawyer maybe. An appeal to Sheriff Hatcher, who may or may not be useful depending on how much of his usefulness is already pledged to Creel. She thought, a train ticket east and starting over again somewhere else, which is what she had been doing for 2 years and which had gotten her here. She thought about Martin Boone, and then she stopped herself, because Martin Boone was not a solution. Martin Boone was a man she had spoken to on maybe a dozen occasions over a month and a half, and she was not the kind of woman who let a difficult situation push her toward a man as if he were a wall to hide behind. She was still awake at midnight when she heard Clara shift beside her, and the child's small hand found hers in the dark in the automatic way of sleeping children, and Pauline held it and thought about Robert saying, "Use it only when there is no other choice," and she thought, maybe it is not that time yet. Maybe there is still something else. What she had not accounted for was how quickly things could move. On Monday morning, Eleanor Aldrich came into the kitchen before breakfast service with an expression Pauline had not seen on her face before, not quite distress, because Eleanor did not do distress, but something adjacent to it, a tightening around the eyes and a particular set to the jaw. "I need to speak with you," she said. She told Pauline that Denton Creel had come to see her the previous evening. He had, with perfect politeness, made a number of observations about the hotel's outstanding maintenance requirements. The section of roof above the third-floor rooms that had needed attention for 2 seasons. The question of whether the hotel's water claim, which was registered through a land agent office that had recently changed hands, was still properly documented. He had mentioned, in passing, that he had some influence with the new ownership of that office, and that he imagined, in the right circumstances, such matters could be sorted out very easily. He had said nothing explicit. He had said everything necessary. "He is trying to pressure me through you," Eleanor said, with the crisp, straight precision of a woman stating an unpleasant fact rather than avoiding it. "And I want you to know that I am not going to be pressured. You have done nothing but good work since you arrived here, and I will not dismiss a good worker because some opportunist with too much time and too little conscience has decided to involve himself in my business. He may make things genuinely difficult for you," Pauline said. "He may," Alina said, "but I have been running this hotel for 11 years without any man's assistance, and I have survived genuinely difficult things before." She paused. "That said, I think you should be aware that he is not a man who accepts being ignored. He will escalate." After Alina left the kitchen, Pauline stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the work table and breathed carefully. Then she thought about Clara spending her afternoon at the Farley store, and something cold moved through her chest. Because Clara was 6 and Ruth's daughter was 8, and the Farley store was on the main street, and Denton Creel was a man who had just demonstrated, with perfect courtesy, that he was willing to use whatever leverage presented itself. She untied her apron and went to find him before breakfast service was done, which was the last thing he expected her to do, and which was why she did it. She found him at the Copper Crown, which opened early for the miners coming off the night shift, sitting at a table with 2 men she did not know, drinking coffee and looking like a man who owned the morning. She walked in, which caused a brief pause in the conversations around her because a woman walking alone into a saloon before 10 in the morning was not a usual occurrence, and she crossed directly to his table and stood before him with her hands at her sides and said, quietly and clearly enough for only him to hear, "I know what you are doing, and I want you to know that I see it completely. I also want you to know that pressing Alina Aldrich through her property concerns is a separate matter from anything between you and me, and if any harm comes to her hotel or to her livelihood because of your interference on my account, I will make certain that the specifics of your methods are known to everyone in this town in sufficient detail that not even your connection to the claims office will protect your reputation. I have a clear memory, and I write a clean letter." He looked at her for a long moment. The easy smile did not quite appear. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "you are not in a position to make threats." "I am not making a threat," she said. "I am making a statement of intentions. There is a distinction." She met his light eyes steadily. "Leave Alina Aldrich alone." She walked out of the saloon and went directly back to the hotel and finished breakfast service without allowing her hands to shake until she was alone in the kitchen with the door closed. She knew, with clear-eyed practicality, that what she had done was brave but not necessarily effective. A man like Creel did not back down from a statement of intentions from a woman with no legal standing and no political connections. What she had done was buy herself a small amount of time before he recalibrated his approach, and she intended to use that time. It was Tuesday. Martin Boone sometimes came in on Tuesdays. He came in at 8:30, later than usual, and he had the look of a man who had already done several hours of physical labor, which was dust on his forearms and a slight tiredness around the eyes that did not reach his actual energy. He sat at his usual place, and she brought the coffee herself rather than sending the boy who helped with service, and she set it down and then, because she had made a decision and was not in the habit of retreating from decisions once made, she sat down in the chair across from him. He looked at her, neither surprised nor unsurprised, just attentive. "I need to speak with you about something," she said. Not in a roundabout way, directly. "All right," he said. She told him about Denton Creel. She told him all of it, from Ruth Farley's initial warning, through the encounter in the alley, through Alina's visit that morning, through what she had said to Creel in the saloon an hour ago. She told it in the same way she had described the cooking difference between last week's eggs and this week's, with precision and without excessive emotion, because she was not asking for his feelings about it. She was giving him the information necessary for an informed response. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He had not interrupted once, which she had noticed and appreciated because most people interrupt. "What do you want to do?" he asked, Not what do you want me to do, which would have implied a kind of direction she had not offered. What do you want to do? I want Clara to be safe, she said, not in a general, hopeful sense. Specifically, I want her protected from the kind of instability that a man like Creel can manufacture around a woman who has no structural protection in this territory. She paused. I have a gold coin, she said. The last thing my husband left me. I have been holding it because I did not want to use it unless there was no other choice, and I think that time may have come. But I am not entirely certain what it buys in this situation. Martin Boone looked at the coffee cup in his hands and then at the table and then at her, and there was a quality to his expression that she had not seen on him before, not quite sad and not quite resolved, but something between the two, like a man who has just made a decision that he was already going to make but that he needed to hear the full question before he could confirm the answer. Put the coin away, he said. She looked at him steadily. Martin. Pauline. He said her name for the first time, and the sound of it was careful and deliberate, the way you say something you have been thinking about for a while. I know what you are working toward, because you are the kind of person who thinks several steps ahead, and because I have been paying attention. And I want to say something to you before you spend that gold piece on a solution that does not actually solve the problem, because a lawyer in this territory with Creel's connections might help you and might not. And a ticket east puts Clara on a train, but it puts you back where you were before you arrived here, and none of that addresses what I think is actually at stake. She waited. She was very good at waiting. I have a ranch, he said. Clean deed, no encumbrances. I have a decent house on it that has been too large for one person for 3 years now. I have a name in this county that carries some weight, not from connections like Creel, but from the ordinary accumulation of being a man who does what he says and pays what he owes. I have 2 good men who work for me and who would, I am confident, receive you and Clara without any difficulty. He looked at her directly. I am not asking you to feel something you do not feel. I am not asking you to pretend anything. What I am saying is that if you were willing, and only if you were willing, the name Boone would put you and Clara outside the reach of what Denton Creel is trying to do in a way that a gold coin cannot. The room was very quiet around them. You are asking me to marry you, Pauline said. Not a question, just placing the word in the air between them so it could be examined. I am asking you to consider it, he said, with everything you know and everything you do not know yet. With full understanding that I am not offering a convenience and then withdrawing it later. I am saying that if you say yes, it is permanent and it is real, and I will spend whatever time it takes earning what that means. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the gold coin in the pouch against her skin. She thought about the night she had lain awake turning over options like cards on a table and coming up short. She thought about a man who fixed roofs in snowstorms and who asked, "What do you want to do?" rather than "Let me handle it." She thought about the way he said her name. She thought, I have been careful my whole life. I have been careful and sensible and clear-eyed, and I have kept my feelings behind a wall because feelings were not the most important thing when there were practical things to be attended to. But Robert is gone, and I am here. And Clara needs more than a careful mother in a hotel kitchen, and this man is asking me something that only a certain kind of man asks, and I know the difference between that kind and the other kind, because I have been paying attention too. I would not want you to think, she said slowly, that I am accepting out of desperation. I would not think that, he said, because you went to the saloon this morning before you came to talk to me. She almost smiled. Almost. I went to the saloon because I was furious. I know, he said, and then quietly, that is one of the things I find remarkable about you. The almost smile became an actual one, small and unguarded and more honest than anything she had showed anyone in a very long time. She reached into the neck of her dress and withdrew the small cloth pouch and opened it and placed the gold coin on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. I want you to refuse this, she said. Something moved across his face. He understood immediately. She could see that he understood immediately, and that understanding felt like its own kind of intimacy. Keep it, he said, "It belongs to Clara." "Yes," she said. She put the coin back in the pouch and pressed it back against her heart and looked at him across the breakfast table in the morning light coming through the hotel window, and she thought, "This is not the end of something. This is a door." "Yes," she said again, and this time she meant the other question entirely. The wedding was arranged with the practical efficiency of two people who were not doing anything for show. Eleanor Aldrich lent Pauline a dress of pale gray wool that fit almost perfectly after a minor adjustment at the shoulders, which Pauline made herself in the 3 evenings between the question and the day. Martin bought a new shirt. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Oakes at the small white church at the north end of the main street on a Thursday morning in October 1878, with Eleanor Aldrich and Ruth Farley as witnesses. Pio and Santos Reyes sitting in the front pew looking proud in the way that people who care about someone look proud when that someone does something good. And Clara standing at Pauline's side in her best dress, holding a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Bess Farley had collected that morning with fierce dedication. When Reverend Oakes pronounced them married and Martin turned to her, there was a brief moment where neither of them knew exactly what the correct gesture was, because this was a union that had begun from practicality and honesty, and was somewhere in the process of becoming something else, and the gap between where they had been last Thursday and where they were standing now was both very short and very wide. Martin solved it by taking her hand and holding it with a quiet solidity that said more than most kisses would have, and she held his back, and Clara looked up at both of them with wide gray eyes and said, with perfect 6-year-old directness, "Are we a family now?" And Martin looked down at her with an expression that, had Pauline been less composed, might have undone her entirely, and said, "Yes, we are a family now." Denton Creel heard about the marriage before noon, which was inevitable in a town of that size. He made no further moves, because Martin Boone was exactly the kind of man whose name and reputation made certain calculations change, and Creel was, if nothing else, a practical man who understood when a particular investment had ceased to be viable. He redirected his attention elsewhere, and Pauline heard no more from him, and she did not spend any significant energy thinking about him after that, because she had other things to think about. The ranch was 4 miles west of town, and it was neither as grand as fear had imagined nor as modest as practicality had prepared her for. It was a solid house of 2 stories, built with the careful attention of a man who intended the building to last, thick-walled adobe on the ground floor, wood-framed rooms above, a covered porch that ran the length of the front face and caught the evening breeze. There was a proper kitchen with a good cast-iron stove, a parlor with a stone fireplace, 4 bedrooms that had been more than sufficient for one man, and that now suddenly made sense as the scale they were. There was a barn and a corral and a vegetable garden that had been allowed to become somewhat ambitious and then somewhat neglected, and that Pauline looked at with the particular assessing eye of a woman who has grown things before and intends to grow them again. Pio and Santos Reyes greeted her, and Clara with the warm, straightforward courtesy of men who had decided that Martin Boone was a good man worth working for, and that anyone Martin Boone brought home was therefore worth receiving well. They lived in a small bunkhouse near the barn. Santos, the younger brother, who was perhaps 25, immediately crouched down to Clara's eye level and produced from somewhere about his person a small carved wooden horse that he pressed into her hands with a serious expression and said, "For you, I made it. It does not bite." Clara examined it carefully and said, "Does it have a name?" And Santos said, "It did not until now. You should give it one." Clara thought about this for the entire rest of the afternoon and named it Domingo, which satisfied everyone. Pauline and Martin existed for the first weeks as 2 careful, courteous people sharing a house, which was both comfortable and charged with a quality that she did not name directly, but that she felt in ordinary moments. When he held the kitchen door for her, when she left a cup of coffee on the desk where he read his papers in the evening, When they sat at the supper table with Clara between them, and he listened to the child's account of her day, with the same focused attention he gave to everything he considered worth attending to. They occupied separate rooms, which was the arrangement neither had discussed, but that both understood was the correct one for now, because everything had moved very quickly and there was a great deal of learning still to be done. And Pauline was not a woman who confused efficiency with haste. She had agreed to be his wife. She was in the process of understanding what that could mean beyond the name on the legal document, and she wanted that understanding to be built on something solid before she let herself fall the rest of the way. It was October turning to November when the first real test of ordinary domestic life occurred, and it was not dramatic, it was supper. Martin had an opinion about beans. It was not an aggressive opinion, but it was deeply held, and it emerged during a supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread when he said, carefully, that his mother had seasoned beans with a specific combination of aromatics that he had never been able to exactly replicate, and that the current version was very good but different. Pauline set down her fork. "Tell me the aromatics," she said. "I do not know the names of all of them," he said, which she found both endearing and irritating in equal measure. "Describe them." "One was dark and had a sharp smell. One was dried and looked like seeds. There were 3 other things I cannot specify with any confidence." "This is extremely unhelpful," she said. He looked at her and then he started laughing genuinely with his full self, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh like that, open and unself-conscious, and it rearranged something in her chest. "I know," he said. "I am sorry. My mother was not a woman who wrote recipes down." "Neither was mine," Pauline said, "but at least she described what she was doing while she was doing it." "My mother did not describe things while she was doing them. She just expected you to know. That is an impossible pedagogical approach." He was still laughing slightly. "It absolutely is. It drove my brother entirely mad." They ate the rest of the supper in the easy silence of people who have just found a piece of common ground, and Clara, who had been watching this exchange with the bright attentiveness of a child who understands more than adults think she does, ate 3 servings of beans. Afterward, while Clara was washed and in bed and Pauline was banking the kitchen fire for the night, Martin came to stand in the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of coffee and offered one to her, and she took it, and they stood in the warm, fire-lit kitchen in the cold November night, and he said, "I want to say something." "All right," she said. "I know that the circumstances of this were not conventional, and I know that you came into it with more to manage and more to carry than I did, and that you have been managing and carrying with a grace that I think you have become so accustomed to that you may not realize it is exceptional." He looked at the fire rather than at her, which she understood was the way he spoke about things that mattered to him most. "I also know that I am not an uncomplicated person. I am quiet in ways that can feel like distance, and I have a grief in me that I am still working through, and I do not always say things at the right time. But I want you to know that I am not treating this lightly. Any of it." She held the coffee cup in both hands and felt its warmth and looked at the side of his face in the firelight. "Martin," she said, "I know that. I just wanted to say it." "I know you did," she paused. "I am also not an uncomplicated person." "No," he said, with a quality in the word that was entirely appreciative. "You are decidedly not." She looked at him then, and he turned from the fire and looked back, and the space between them was neither large nor small but very precisely what it was, 2 people who had started something with honesty, and were in the process of discovering that honesty has a way of becoming its own kind of intimacy. She reached out and put her free hand briefly on his arm, the first deliberate contact she had initiated, and felt him absolutely still under her touch. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you have already done." He covered her hand with his own for a moment, warm and solid and careful. "Good night, Pauline," he said. "Good night, Martin," she said. She lay in her room that night listening to the wind on the Arizona plain and smiled at the ceiling in the dark. Winter on the ranch was a revelation. Pauline had spent her adult life in towns, in rented rooms and boarding houses and hotel kitchens, and she had forgotten, or perhaps had never quite known, what it was like to live on land that was yours, to walk out in the morning and see only open country to the horizon, to have the silence of it be large and clean rather than the compressed quiet of thin walls. She threw herself into the work with the particular energy of a woman who has found a task equal to her capacity for it. She overhauled the kitchen organization, established a vegetable garden plan for spring, learned from Santos which parts of the garden soil needed amendment, and found that she and Santos had lengthy, satisfying conversations about growing things that she had not expected. She took over the household accounts with the neat, careful efficiency she had mentioned to Alina Aldrich months ago, and found that the ranch finances were sound but not optimized. And she made 3 suggestions to Martin over supper one evening that he listened to with focused attention and then said, "You are right about all 3 of those," and changed the practices without further discussion. Clara flourished. The child had lived her whole short life in the close, uncertain quarters of poverty, and the open space of the ranch worked on her the way sun works on a plant that has been kept indoors, visibly, quickly, and completely. She followed Santos around with the dedicated attentiveness of someone learning a craft, and Santos, who was patient in the way that genuinely skillful people often are, taught her to identify birds by their calls and how to move quietly near horses so as not to startle them and how to find the North Star. She followed Pio, the older brother, when he was doing fence work and maintenance, and Pio, who was quieter than his brother and had a dry, understated humor, tolerated her presence and occasionally made a joke that she did not understand but laughed at anyway, which Pio seemed to find more satisfying than comprehension. She asked Martin approximately 140 questions per day, which he answered with unfailing patience, and when he did not know the answer, with a trip to whatever book or almanac might contain it, which she found enormously satisfying. She began calling him Papa sometime in December, with no announcement and no drama, just the simple application of the word as if it had always been his. And Martin, who had been reading by the fire when it happened, looked up from his book and met Pauline's eyes across the room, and something moved through both of them that was too large for the ordinary dimensions of a weeknight. After Clara was in bed, Pauline found Martin on the porch in the cold December air, looking at the stars, which were extraordinary out here away from town, and the way stars tend to be in the clear, dry air of the Arizona Territory winter. She brought his coat out to him because he had left without it, and he took it and put it on, and she stood beside him and they looked at the stars together in silence for a while. "She loves you," Pauline said. "I know," he said, and then after a moment, "I love her too, if that is all right to say." "It is more than all right," Pauline said. He turned to look at her then, and the starlight was enough to see by if you were paying attention, and she was always paying attention. She thought about the wall she had built around herself after Robert, after the homestead, after the long year of managing and surviving and keeping the feelings behind the practical necessities. She thought about how walls that are built for protection sometimes stay up past their usefulness. She took a step toward him, which was the clearest thing she knew how to do, and he was absolutely still for a moment. And then he turned fully to face her and put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that she had not prepared herself for. And he kissed her in the cold night air with the particular care of a man who has been waiting long enough that the waiting itself has taught him something. She put her hands on his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and solid, and thought, "There it is. There is the real thing." They stood on the porch for a long time after that, talking quietly about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, and when they finally went inside, the house felt different, not in any detail she could have pointed to, but in the quality of the air, in the way the lamplight fell, in the sense that the rooms had arranged themselves more fully around the life being lived inside them. January brought hard frost, and a supply run into town that included stopping at Ruth Farley's store, where Ruth looked at Pauline with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose read of a situation has been fully confirmed. "You look well," Ruth said, which meant she looked happy, which both of them understood. "I am well," Pauline said, which was the simplest and truest statement she had made in a long time. She saw Alina Aldrich at the hotel, and they had coffee in Alina's small sitting room behind the front desk, and Alina asked after the ranch and after Clara and after Martin with the blunt, warm curiosity of a woman who has earned the right to ask directly. "He is a good man," Pauline said. "I know he is," Alina said. "I told you that." "You did. Are you telling me I was right?" "I am telling you that you were right," Pauline said, and Alina smiled with her whole face for the first time in Pauline's experience of her. She also heard, through the ordinary channels of small-town information, that Denton Creel had turned his attentions to a mining dispute that was consuming his energy and that of Sheriff Hatcher, and that his influence in the Land Claims Office had become the subject of a formal complaint lodged by 3 miners whose paperwork had mysteriously disappeared twice. The complaint had been forwarded to the territorial authorities in Tucson, and the general consensus in Redrock Crossing was that Creel's particular arrangement with the claims office was entering a season of significant inconvenience. Pauline thought about this with a clear, satisfied calm, and then set it aside, because it was no longer her concern. What was her concern was the note she had made 3 weeks ago and not yet said aloud, which was that she might be carrying a child. She told Martin on a Sunday afternoon in February in the kitchen, while they were making supper together, which had become a practice that had evolved organically because he liked to be useful, and she liked the company, and Clara sat at the table and supervised with the seriousness of an apprentice regulator. She set down the wooden spoon and turned to face him and said, "I think we are going to have a baby." He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a transparency of joy that she had not seen in him before, because he was a man who kept most things close, and this he was not keeping close. This was entirely visible. "Pauline," he said. "I have not seen the doctor yet," she said. "I wanted to tell you first." He brought her hands up and pressed his lips to them, not a formal gesture, just a person in the grip of something real. Clara, from the table, observed this with interest and said, "What is happening?" Martin looked at her over Pauline's hands and said, with the careful, clear attention he gave her always, "Your mother has told me some very good news. We might be having a new member of the family." Clara considered this. A baby. A baby. Clara thought about it for a serious moment. "Will it sleep in my room?" "That is a very good question," Martin said. "We will discuss it." Clara decided this was satisfactory and returned to her supervision. Dr. Lander confirmed the pregnancy in March, with the matter-of-fact warmth of a country doctor who had delivered many babies in improbable circumstances, and was therefore inclined to treat the news as entirely manageable. He told Pauline she was healthy and the baby was growing, and that he expected no complications, which he said while glancing briefly at the notes he had made during his last 5 deliveries, all of which had been uncomplicated. The spring proceeded with the particular beauty that the Arizona Territory was capable of when the winter rains had been sufficient. Wildflowers on the hills to the north, the vegetable garden coming up exactly as Pauline had planned it, the cattle fat from good pasture, the air smelling of sage and something sweeter that was harder to name. Martin hired a 3rd ranch hand, a young man from Albuquerque named Felix, who was 17 and earnest, and who made Pio slightly crazy with his perpetual optimism, which Pio bore with the resigned affection of a man accustomed to the young. The long summer evenings were Pauline's favorite time. She and Martin had fallen into the habit of sitting on the porch after Clara was in bed, sometimes talking, sometimes in the companionable silence that only people who have genuinely learned each other can sustain without awkwardness. She was visibly pregnant by June, round and warm and tired in the afternoons, in a way that she found simultaneously inconvenient and deeply reassuring, because the tiredness meant everything was happening as it should. Martin had a way of noticing when she was tired before she said anything, and producing a cushion, or a cup of tea, or a suggestion that someone else could handle whatever she was about to do, without making a fuss of it, which she appreciated precisely because he made no fuss. She asked him once, on a June evening when the sky was the color of a dying coal and the air was still carrying some of the day's heat, "Do you miss Tennessee?" He thought about it. "I miss my brother," he said. "The land, no. This is my land now. I'm not the kind of person who misses a place once I have rooted somewhere else." He looked at her. "Do you miss Missouri?" She thought about it with the same honesty. "I miss what Missouri was before it stopped being what I needed," she said. "I miss the idea of it. The actual Missouri I left not particularly." "And here," he said. She looked at the darkening sky and the first stars appearing over the hills and Clara's carved wooden horse sitting on the porch rail where the child had left it when she went in, and the warm weight of the baby moving against her ribs, and the entirely real and solid presence of Martin Boone beside her in the cooling evening. "Here," she said. "I do not miss anything." He took her hand and held it against his knee, and they watched the stars come out. The baby came on a night in mid-September, which was almost exactly a year from when Pauline had walked into Redrock Crossing with her carpetbag and her daughter and her gold coin and her unbroken jaw. Dr. Lander was fetched by Felix, who rode for town at a pace that suggested he had taken the urgency of the errand rather literally. Martin stayed near through the whole of it, in the way that men in that era were not always encouraged to, but that he had flatly declined to be moved from. And Dr. Lander, who was pragmatic about such things, allowed it on the grounds that Martin Boone was likely to be useful rather than in the way, which proved correct. The baby was a boy, born just before dawn, with dark hair like his mother and the particular steady expression in his new eyes that made Pauline laugh, exhausted and wholly joyful, because it was so entirely Martin. They named him William Robert Boone, which was Martin's father's name and Robert's name together, which seemed to Pauline exactly right, a bridge built from what had come before to what was coming now. Clara, who had been kept in her room through the night by Santos and Pio, who had contrived an elaborate campaign of storytelling and card games to occupy her, was brought in at first light to meet her brother. She stood at the bedside and looked at William with the solemn, assessing attention of a scientist examining new data. And she said, "He is very small." And Martin, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with Pauline's hand in his and his son in the crook of his other arm, said, "He will get larger." Clara said, "How do you know?" And Martin said, "That is what babies do." And Clara said, "Domingo was small once too," which was not precisely applicable but which she seemed to find sufficient as parallel reasoning. Pauline looked at her family arranged around her in the early morning light and thought about the gold coin. She retrieved it from the cloth pouch 3 days later, when she was well and up, and the house had settled back into its ordinary rhythms with the addition of one small, demanding, entirely wonderful new element. She brought it to Martin in the kitchen and set it on the table between them as she had done that October morning in the hotel dining room, but this time the gesture meant something entirely different. "I want you to keep this," she said. "Not for using, just for keeping." He looked at it and then at her. This was Robert's. It was Robert's promise, she said. "Use it only when there is no other choice. I want to give it to you because you are the reason I never had to use it. That matters to me." He was quiet for a moment. "And if one day we are in a situation where there genuinely is no other choice, then we use it," she said, "together, as Boone." He picked up the coin and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and then he put it in the small tin box on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet where he kept the deed to the ranch and the important papers, and he put it there with the same careful attention he gave to everything he considered worth preserving, which told her everything she needed to know. The autumn of 1879 was a good season. The cattle sold well at the fall market in Tucson, which Martin and Pio made the journey to while Santos and Felix maintained the ranch, and which produced enough profit to repair the barn roof and purchase 2 more head of breeding stock, and still have a solid remainder in the ranch account. William grew at an entirely satisfactory rate and had developed the vocal confidence of a person who expects his opinions to be attended to. Clara, who had begun attending the small school that the town had established in the spring in a converted storefront on the main street, came home every afternoon with the particular illuminated expression of a child who has discovered that the world is much larger than she had previously understood and is delighted about it. Pauline wrote to a cousin in Missouri whom she had not corresponded with in 3 years, a long letter that covered a great deal of ground and ended with what she was aware was an understated account of the past year, but that she wrote with the particular warmth of someone who is genuinely content, which is harder to fake and easier to feel than its opposite. The cousin wrote back in January and said she was glad, and that she had always suspected Pauline was equal to whatever the world put in front of her, which was the nicest thing she had ever said. Denton Creel's difficulties with the territorial authorities continued through the winter and concluded, in February of 1880, with the revocation of his mining claims and a formal censure of the Land Claims Office, and the departure of its previous operator under circumstances that were described in the Redrock Crossing newspaper with the careful legal language that covers what ordinary language would call being run out of town. Creel himself moved south to Tucson, where he was presumably pursuing opportunities with a new set of victims, and the general feeling in Redrock Crossing was that the air was cleaner for his departure. Pauline read the newspaper account at the breakfast table and said nothing, and Martin, who had already read it, said nothing, and Clara said, "What does censure mean?" And Martin explained it with the careful precision of a man who takes children's questions seriously, and that was the end of Denton Creel's influence on their lives. Spring of 1880 came with a letter from Martin's brother James in Tennessee, announcing that he was married and that his wife was expecting, and that he intended, if at all possible, to make the journey west within the year to meet his brother's family in person. Martin read this at the kitchen table, and his face did something quiet and private that Pauline recognized as significant, because it was the particular expression he wore when something touched him at a level he was still learning to accommodate. "Write to him tonight," she said. "Tell him to come." He looked at her. "It is a long journey." "It is," she said. "He should make it anyway." Family should not be conducted entirely by letter when there is the possibility of the actual thing. Martin wrote the letter that evening, and Pauline added a paragraph at the bottom that she did not read aloud to him first, which told James Boone that his brother was loved and well, and that any family of his was welcome in their home for as long as they wanted to stay. James and his wife Eleanor, whose coincidence of name with Eleanor Aldrich produced a brief organizational challenge in how to address them in the same letter, arrived in September of 1880, traveling by train to Tucson, and then by stage to Redrock Crossing. And the meeting between the brothers was the kind of scene that does not need describing in detail, because anyone who has seen 2 brothers who love each other deeply reunite after years of separation and distance knows what it looks like, and what it costs both of them to keep their composure through it. And Martin Boone managed it for approximately the first 30 seconds before it became clear he was not going to manage it any longer, which Pauline felt in her own chest like a hand closing. James Boone was younger than Martin by 6 years, which put him at approximately 28, and he was similar in the broad architecture of his face but entirely different in energy. Where Martin was still water, James was a moving stream, quick to laugh and to speak and to offer opinions and to revise them and to laugh again. His wife Eleanor, called Ellie by James and quickly by everyone else, was a slight, sharp-eyed woman of 25 from Nashville who took in the ranch, the landscape, the household, and Pauline in approximately 4 minutes and said, "This is remarkable. I did not know it could look like this. meaning the Arizona Territory in the late golden light of early September, and Pauline, who had grown into a deep and genuine love for the particular beauty of this land, felt that she and Ellie were going to understand each other well. They stayed for 6 weeks, which was enough time for James to develop strong opinions about cattle ranching and share them with P.O., who received them with the patient, faintly amused dignity of a man who has forgotten more about cattle than most people ever know. It was enough time for Ellie to become deeply involved in Pauline's kitchen, which was an adventure for everyone. It was enough time for Martin and James to spend long evenings on the porch talking in the low voices of men who are covering a great deal of ground that has been waiting, and for Pauline to hear, through the open window while settling William, the sound of her husband laughing at something his brother said, the specific laughter of a man in the company of someone who has known him since before he was the person he had become, and to feel the warmth of that sound spread through the house like light. Clara informed James, within the first hour of his arrival, that she was 7 years old and could name 43 birds by their calls and could find the North Star without any help from anyone. And James told her that he could name 4 birds and the only star he could identify was the sun. And Clara looked at him with a kind of gentle pity and said, "I will teach you." And James told Martin that evening that his daughter was the best person he had met in the Arizona Territory, which Martin received with the quiet pride of a man who has known this for some time. The night before James and Ellie left for the return journey, the 4 of them sat on the porch long after Clara and William were in bed, and James said, with the particular directness that ran in the Boone family, "I want to say something." "People are always saying that in this family," Pauline observed. "It is because there are things worth saying," James said. "Our mother would be very proud of you, Martin, of all of this." He gestured at the house and the land and the dark, star-filled sky and Pauline at his brother's side. "She would have loved your family." Martin was quiet for a moment. "She would have argued with Pauline," he said, "about the right way to cook beans." "She would have lost," James said. "She absolutely would have," Martin agreed. Pauline pressed her shoulder against Martin's in the dark and felt him press back. And across the porch she could see Ellie's hand in James's, and the 4 of them sat in the Arizona night, and the stars were enormous overhead, and the coyotes were singing somewhere out in the dark hills, and the world was exactly what it was, which was imperfect and beautiful and large enough to hold everything that had happened and everything still coming. James and Ellie departed with an invitation already standing for their return, which James accepted on the spot with his characteristic immediacy, and promises of letters, and Clara's solemn gift of a small list of bird names written in her best handwriting, which she pressed into James's hands and told him to study, and a hug from Martin that lasted long enough to say everything that the porch conversation had covered, and a few additional things besides. The following years built themselves on the foundation of what had been established in that first hard autumn of 1878, and they built slowly and well, the way good things tend to build when the foundation is honest. Pauline planted the vegetable garden larger every spring and began selling the surplus at the Redrock Crossing market that had established itself on Saturday mornings, which produced a modest but real income that she applied to a small account in her own name at the town's new bank, not from distrust of Martin, but from the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had learned what it meant to have no resources that were entirely her own, and who intended that her daughter would grow up knowing what it felt like to hold something under your own hand. Martin understood this completely. He had, in fact, suggested it. Clara turned 8 and 9 and 10, and grew into a person of the particular formidable quality that children become when they have been taken seriously from an early age, curious about everything, direct in her opinions, deeply loyal, occasionally exasperating, and possessed of a judgment about people and animals that was, if not infallible, considerably better than average. She was Martin's daughter in every way that mattered, and she knew it and he knew it, and Pauline watched them together with a love that was simple and large. William walked at 11 months and talked at 13 and had strong views about everything by the age of 2, which was both charming and entirely exhausting. He had Martin's steadiness under his mother's energy, which produced a combination that Pio described, with characteristic understatement, as a handful, but a good handful, which Santos agreed was accurate. In the spring of 1883, when William was 3.5 and Clara was 10, and the ranch was running at its best capacity since Martin had bought it, Pauline sat at the kitchen table on a quiet April afternoon and wrote in the small journal she had begun keeping in 1880 as a record of the ranch's seasons and her own thinking. And she wrote, "5 years ago I walked into Redrock Crossing with everything I had in a bag and 1 gold coin I could not bring myself to spend. I thought about what I needed and what was possible and what I was willing to do and what I was not. I thought about my daughter and my dead husband and the limits of what a woman alone can do in a territory that does not extend much protection to people who are alone." She paused and looked at the kitchen around her, the good stove, the shelf of books that had grown to fill 2 full sections of the wall, the carvings that Clara had made in her woodworking phase that still sat on the windowsill, William's small boots by the door, the tin box on the top shelf. She wrote, "I did not use the gold coin. A man I barely knew told me to keep it and offered me his name instead, and he meant it with the whole of himself. And I said yes because I had enough clarity to recognize what was real when I encountered it." She wrote, "William Robert Boone can recite the alphabet forward and backward, and is currently attempting to teach the barn cat to sit on command, which the cat finds offensive. Clara has told him the cat is a cat and not a dog, and he has said that this is not the point, which is, I think, correct. Martin is in the south pasture with Pio fixing the fence line that the late storm damaged, and he will come in at supper time with dust on his hands and mud on his boots, and he will ask what there is to eat in exactly the tone of a man who is hungry and happy, and I will tell him, and we will sit at this table, the 4 of us, and it will be the ordinary best thing." She closed the journal and went to start supper, and when Martin came in at the end of the day with his hands dusty and his boots muddy, she had the beans on and the cornbread in the oven, and she turned from the stove, and he came directly to her and kissed her in the way he had in that first year on the porch, careful and wholly deliberate, and Clara called from the next room that she was hungry, and William appeared in the doorway dragging a protesting cat. And Martin broke the kiss to say, firmly, that the cat did not eat at the table, and William said it was not eating at the table. It was sitting near the table, which was different, and Pauline pressed her face against Martin's shoulder and laughed until she had to hold on to him to stay standing. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat together by the fireplace, not talking particularly, just present in the evening in the way they had been present on 100 evenings before this one. And Pauline took down the tin box and opened it and took out the gold coin and held it between her fingers. Martin, who was reading, looked over at her. She held it up in the firelight and it caught the glow and threw small pieces of warmth across the ceiling. "I want to give this to Clara when she is grown," she said, "with the story of it, so she knows what things can cost and what they can become." Martin was quiet for a moment. Then, "Robert left her a good mother," he said, "and the coin to say so." "He did," Pauline said. She closed her fingers around it and then put it back in the box, and Martin went back to his book, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the fire. And outside, the Arizona night was cold and clear and immense, full of stars that had been there long before either of them and would be there long after, but that were, at this precise moment, hanging over a ranch where the lights were burning warm and the family inside it was whole. She thought about the morning she had walked into Redrock Crossing. She thought about the well in the center of town and the water from the public ladle in Clara's small hand in hers, and the gold coin pressed against her palm like a compass pointing at the last possible choice. She thought, "I did not know what was coming. I could not have predicted any of this specific, beautiful, ordinary life. I could not have known that the man reading by the fire would be mine, or that the children sleeping upstairs would be everything I needed them to be, or that the land outside would come to feel like the first place I had ever lived that fit the actual dimensions of who I was. She thought, but I knew enough to keep walking. I knew enough to look clearly at what was real. I knew enough to say yes when yes was the right answer. Martin turned a page and shifted slightly so that the arm around her settled more comfortably. An entirely automatic adjustment, the body language of a person who has become so accustomed to another person's presence that it is incorporated into the unconscious movement of ordinary hours. And Pauline felt the warmth of him along her side and thought, yes, this was the right answer. This was and would continue to be the right answer. The fire burned low and the night deepened around the house, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead. And in the barn the horses were quiet, and in the bunkhouse Pio and Santos and Felix were playing cards by lamplight as they did most evenings, and across the main street of Redrock, crossing 4 miles east, the town went about its business. And in a house in Tennessee, James Boone was reading a letter from his brother and planning his next visit. And in the small rooms of all the years ahead, there were things still to come. Another good spring, another difficult winter, another supper conversation that would go sideways into laughter, more of Clara growing into herself, more of William becoming the particular person he was going to be, more of the ordinary accumulated extraordinary business of a life built on honesty and care, and the willingness to recognize something true when it appears in front of you, especially when you are worn out and road-dusted and carrying everything you own in a single bag. Pauline put her hand over Martin's and felt his fingers close around hers in the automatic, certain way they always did. The fire crackled once, settling. Outside, a single coyote called from the hills, that long wild note that carried across the desert floor and rose into the dark and went on, and then fell quiet. And the night held the sound for a moment afterward like a hand holding something precious, and then let it go.